Okay, guys, this is a recording of for Tuesday the 17th, and we're going to cover kind of the end of World War II and a little bit the beginning of the Cold War, or kind of the setup for the Cold War itself. So the last time that we left off, the last time that I saw you guys in class for notes, we were talking about the fighting of World War II very briefly. And specifically, we had gotten into talking about the fighting on the Pacific Front. Remember that the fighting on the Pacific Front is happening like parallel to the war in Europe, so sort of at the same time, but a very different war. It's mostly the United States Navy and Marines, and it's almost entirely kind of happening at sea and on these little islands in the Pacific. So we talked about already the fact that the Japanese army kind of sweeps through South Asia and through sort of the kind of South Pacific down here. We talked about the Americans and American allies abandoned on the Philippines as the Japanese army sweeps, or excuse me, military in general sweeps through their army and their navy. This is all happening, pretty much right after, in the days and weeks right after Pearl Harbor. And I think we talked about the last thing that should probably be in your notes was the Battle of Midway. Midway was the big turning point battle in the Pacific. It happened in June of 1942. And before Midway, essentially the Japanese army was pushing out, where they were fighting an offensive war, gaining territory, taking territory. The Battle of Midway is a massive naval battle. It severely wounds, damages a lot of the Japanese Navy, their aircraft carriers, etc. And from then on, essentially the United States is going to be pushing back towards Japan. You'll notice that Midway is in June of 42. The war against Japan is not going to end until August of 42, August of 45, like about 3 years later. So there's a lot. So it's not going to be a direct drive towards Japan. Instead, we're going to spend most of the next 3 years in the Pacific operating on a strategy called island hopping. Island hopping sounds like, I don't know, kind of little and cute, but it's in fact a fairly brutal form of warfare. Essentially, as you can kind of see on the map here, the U.S. Navy sort of splits into two, and the goal is to sort of kind of go through this area that the Japanese have conquered and try to like retake a bunch of these islands. Keep in mind that down here where my the arrow mouse is circling, this is not like, these aren't Japanese people living on the islands like civilians, right? These are civilian populations of islanders that have been invaded by Japan. So we're fighting these kind of like pretty brutal hand-to-hand battles, a type of warfare the United States is not very used to. It's very tropical, it's hot, it's jungly, right? We haven't really fought a war like that before, with maybe the exception of the Philippine insurrection. This is kind of what's going on while we're executing the whole Italy plan and kind of moving in Europe. Oops, pardon me. It's kind of the mid to late 1944, right around the same time that the U.S. and our allies start closing in on Germany in Europe, is also the same time that the U.S. Navy starts to get really like within kind of striking distance of Japan. Significantly in October of 44, the U.S. retakes the Philippines. That's a very big deal for us, right? Because we sort of left people behind there. So this is a very famous picture of MacArthur sort of triumphantly returning to the Philippines. It's around this time when the Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, basically the last of the Japanese aircraft carriers is really damaged. So the Japanese Navy can't really like prosecute an offensive war anymore at this point. It's kind of like the kind of winter into 44 and 45. And so this is really when we start to see kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze, very infamously, these are one-way suicide bomber pilots who are trained to dive bomb their planes with themselves inside into like Allied ships to sink them. They're sort of terrifyingly effective at first because we don't expect it, but once we kind of figure out what's going on, they are, I don't want to say easy, but they're like possible to counter. So they're not like a turning point or etc. What they do is they really convince the American high command that the sort of Japanese army is prepared to a degree that we're maybe not used to defend their homeland in really extreme ways. By the time that we hit like the spring of 1945, right around the same time that we're invading Germany and then Hitler's going to commit suicide and Germany's going to surrender, we're going to fight the last two really big battles in the Pacific, right down here, Okinawa and Iwo Jima. These are like the two of the deadliest battles for the United States in the entire war. It's like these two plus the D-Day invasion. That's where like the majority of the American dead happen. And you can kind of see from looking at this map in Iwo Jima in particular, like what these do once we have won these battles, which are not easy to win, they put us in a pretty good line to stage bombing raids over Japan, which we haven't been able to do. Up to this point, up to the spring of 1945, the United States has not encountered too many like actual Japanese civilians, right? We've been sort of trying to get to Japan, but haven't encountered Japanese civilians. Okinawa and Iwo Jima, though, are actually occupied by like Japanese people. There's a lot of imperialistic issues there as well, but essentially there's Japanese civilians on both Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And so the type of resistance that we see from civilians on those islands also, I think, intensifies our sense, whether correct or not, that Japanese civilians aren't going to surrender in the same way that the German civilians have or kind of are doing as these wars are happening. So it's at this point in like kind of March-ish of 1945 that the United States starts to execute a massive bombing raid on lots of Japanese cities, but Tokyo specifically, so the capital. On March 9th and 10th, at least 200,000 Japanese civilians, we think, are killed by these really intense firebombing raids. This is napalm, right, that we talked about. Lots of Japanese houses are very flammable. They often are made of essentially like very strong paper. So the city just, is devastated and very, very burned. There's lots of reports that even the air over Tokyo reaches what we call flash point, which is where it's so hot that like air itself catches on fire. That's potentially debatable, but it gives you a sense of the like sheer amount of firepower that we're deploying on Tokyo itself. We don't talk about it as much as the atomic bombs, but this actually kills more civilians, at least directly, than the 2 atomic bomb droppings. So this is kind of going on in the spring, again, while Germany is surrendering. It's in the middle of all of this that Roosevelt dies and Truman replaces him. Remember that we said the last time I saw you guys that Truman is like he was kind of put on the ticket to like balance FDR out. The party's not super happy that he's in. He's not very well connected. He's only been vice president for like a few weeks when this happens. He only finds out that the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb is a thing like after Roosevelt dies. So he's really not very dialed in, you might say. But FDR had already been scheduled to go to a big another big 3 meetup with like the heads of, Great Britain and the Soviet Union. And so Truman is going to go in his stead. This is the Potsdam Conference. This is one of those big World War II conferences that I talked about again the last time we saw each other. That is a good one to know. We have kind of a new big 3, right? Truman has replaced FDR. Stalin survives. He lives forever. He's the head of the Soviet Union for like 30 years. And also, I think kind of surprisingly, Winston Churchill, the wartime prime minister of Great Britain, has been voted out and replaced by a guy named Clement Attlee. I've never quite understood why, to be quite frank. At the Potsdam Conference, this sort of new big 3, they're going to finalize plans for dividing Europe and especially Germany, which we'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of these notes. They decide basically that Japan needs to surrender unconditionally. So we're not going to, essentially, at Potsdam, we know that Japan probably would surrender at this point if we said, like, let them they want to keep their emperor, and they want to keep like a couple of the territories that they've invaded too. So they would have surrendered at this point with some conditions, and we sort of make the decision to accept unconditional surrender, like no conditions whatsoever. You need to just surrender and let us like figure it out. It's while Truman is at Potsdam while he's at this conference that the Manhattan Project is going to successfully detonate their first, this is like a test atomic bomb. We call it the Trinity test. It's like a mini version of one of the big atomic bombs that we have built. We detonate it in the New Mexico desert because definitely where you want to test atomic weaponry is like in the middle of your own country. Yay. So we do that in July while Truman's at Potsdam. He gets word of it. He tells Stalin like, hey, we've got this weapon we didn't tell you about. I've seen a lot of argument that this is essentially the beginning of the Cold War, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go forward, but that's a potential point there. Speaking of the Manhattan Project, just to make sure that you know what this is and what's going on, as pretty much as soon as the war starts, or actually even a little before, we start this top secret project. It's in Los Alamos, New Mexico. It's called the Manhattan Project, to develop some sort of weapon based on essentially nuclear physics. By the end of the war, we've developed these two right here. They're called Little Man and Fat Boy. One of them operates on fusion and the other one on fission. I think I've got that correct. And so Truman, having been president for like a month and a half at this point, has this decision like, okay, we've successfully detonated a test. So we know this probably works. We know it's big. We don't know exactly what it will do. So what, like, do we drop it? Do we not drop it? Like, what do we do? And so he, as you know, is going to make the decision first to drop a bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. And then only a few days later, very quickly, to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki in August of 1945. A big point of debate or contention is why we don't wait longer in between the two atomic bomb droppings. And a good thing to know that may have kind of played into this decision is what I have here in red in the center, which is this the Soviet Union essentially declares war against Japan right here in the middle, and the United States is very concerned. We do not want the Soviet Union to play a role in subduing Japan because we don't want to have to share occupation of Japan with the Soviet Union after the war. We're already kind of concerned about the whole Germany thing is going, right? So that's an often cited reason why we choose to drop the second bomb so quickly without really giving the Japanese government like a lot of time to respond. They have some time, right? But not a ton. So that's the atomic bombs down there. The atomic bombs do what we want them to do. They are going to bring about the unconditional surrender of Japan. They're going to announce their surrender on August 15th, but it's not going to be formally signed until September 2nd, which is why that's usually considered like VJ Day. But in reality, it's August is really when the war ends. You very much need to know, this is pretty important, you need to know that the war starts in Europe in 1939, that the U.S. enters in 1941, and it's good if you know that's in December, like towards the end of that year. You need to know that the war ends both in Germany and Japan in 1945, but that it ends in Germany a few months earlier. Specifically, the war against Germany ends in May, and then the war against Japan ends here in September. That's not so important that you know the months, but just that you understand that the war against Japan continues for a few months after the war against Germany. That's kind of the key takeaway there. Why did the Allies win? You can sort of see this as a pretty common College Board question. So the Allies, the three big allies, so us, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, actually are very good at cooperating in terms of like their strategies. We're fighting in different spheres. The United States and Great Britain fight pretty closely together, but we don't ever really fight like alongside Soviet soldiers so much, but we fight kind of in consonance with them, and we're able to strategize our war effort like broadly very well, considering that we're going to wind up like bitter enemies with the Soviet Union within like a year. That's pretty impressive. U.S. industrial production is not to be underestimated, right? All of our industrialization. We are the arsenal of democracy, remember, so that's a big deal. Big scientific, technological advances, sonar, radar, the atomic bomb, essentially like television and computers in many ways, right? Those are big developments. Helicopters. And also in the United States in particular, we have a much more unified war effort than we really have had in a long time, as far as most Americans see this as like a good war, a war with a cause. We're fighting a war for democracy. I think that's something that a lot more people like buy into here in World War II than even in World War I itself. A few little aftermath type things that you need to know a bit about. Number one, the death toll for World War II is enormous. By most measures, or at least by some measures, World War II is the deadliest event in like human history. I'm going to send you guys in your email tomorrow a supplemental. It's like about a 15-minute video that you can watch that visualizes the death toll, because it's so many, it's just hard to even picture. So I recommend checking that out if you like kind of data visualizations at all, or if you're interested just in World War II in general. But I'll send you that because it's hard to even like wrap your mind around. Basically, every symbol on the screen represents 100,000 people dead. It's by estimate, and you just see how many. I mean, look at the Soviet army flags up here, 100,000. I mean, it's just an insane number of people in both theaters of the war. Partially because, and look at this is China, right? This is the civilian death toll in China. Like, 100,000 people, each one of those little skulls. Partially because the civilian death toll is so high. World War II is the first war that we really follow up with the war crime tribunals. So this idea that, yes, we're at war, and yes, in war you kill people, but there's some things that you can do during a war that go beyond fighting a war and go into being like a crime, a war crime, right? The international community, for the first time, really ever, after World War II, is going to hold a series of tribunals that kind of rolling. So they meet a couple of times. The one is in Nuremberg, Germany. It's just like one of the few German cities that hasn't been like pulverized. And at Nuremberg, they're mostly trying Nazi, like high-ranking Nazis, like Hitler's sort of high command, and then also people who were very involved in directing the Holocaust. So like commandants of concentration camps, like leaders of SS death squads, those kinds of people. In Tokyo, they're going to try Japanese war criminals, people involved in like the Bataan Death March, or involved in the slaughter of Chinese villages, those types of things. We're not generally talking about like your average soldier here. We are mostly talking about high-ranking generals, right, officers, etc. This is considered a big turning point in terms of kind of a world court or world norms around warfare and around what's acceptable and what's not. So that's, again, the Nuremberg trials are the most famous and the most likely to say show up on a test. To end World War II and then to kind of trigger, excuse me, our discussion of the Cold War. Basically, by the end of World War II, here's kind of where the US is at. We know that we are a big world power now, and we have decided that if we're going to be a big world power, our goals are going to be, we want international stability. We want some sort of like world government that can not ensure total peace everywhere all the time, but that can sort of mediate or monitor conflicts. We want a stable global economy, so we want to be able to trade and travel freely. And we are increasingly becoming concerned with stem the growth of communism. So like to slow or stop or mitigate the degree to which communism seems to be taking over. We're really concerned about Europe at this point, but kind of the world in general. And so you can see kind of in those seeds, the beginning of the like post-World War II world and also the beginning of the Cold War. So we're going to swap here from our World War II notes, which are available on our class classroom if you are, where I usually put the old note sets. And we're going to swap out and take a look a little bit at the beginning of this fairly long note set here. This note set, Cold War and Culture, this would be about a 5-dayer in class. It's fairly long, and the Cold War can be kind of complicated. The part of this that we're going to work on today is mostly like aftermath of World War II kind of structural stuff, shaking up like recreation. And then tomorrow's notes, this is Wednesday the 18th, we'll be getting a little more into like how does the Cold War start and what is the Cold War. Okay. So here's our post-war goals that we were just looking at. To accomplish these, and especially the first two here is kind of what we're mostly talking about today, and we'll talk about 3 tomorrow. To accomplish these, a few entities that are going to be created. The United Nations, commonly known as the UN. You need to know that the United Nations is created by a group of countries with the United States in the lead and sort of the other allies as well in the wake of World War II. So this is like one of those cause-effect things that you absolutely need to know. World War II like causes the creation of the United Nations. It's still around today. It functions as, I would say, kind of a cross between like a World Congress and a World Court as far as it goes. The big difference between the United Nations and its predecessor, the League of Nations, is the UN has the ability to enforce its edicts by calling up what we call a peacekeeping force. What that really is essentially an army that's called up from its sort of component member states. The UN has a General Assembly that every member nation is a part of, and then a Security Council that's kind of like the ruling council that can veto things, right, etc. So sort of the upper lower house type setup. And on that Security Council with permanent veto power are the main allies from World War II, the US, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. And if you look at that and you're like, oh, the US and the USSR both have veto power, that seems like it might cause problems. Yes, it is absolutely going to cause problems, lots of them, as we'll kind of talk about going forward. That's the United Nations. The United Nations could potentially be referred to as what we call an NGO that you can see in the slide title there. An NGO is a non-government organization. So not a government, right, but a big international organization that maybe takes on some government-y type functions. That's maybe how I would describe that. And so the 3 that you see on here, these are less important than the UN and less likely to show up on the test, but just worth knowing that like we do call the IMF, which is kind of in charge of like currency rates and maintaining systems of international exchange for trade purposes. We create the World Bank that developing countries can apply to for loans if they want to build like a countrywide interstate system or something like that. And we create a structure called GATT that's not been around. It's not around anymore. It's been replaced by the World Bank, or excuse me, by the WTO. And what GATT it was supposed to be like if the United States and Turkey were having trade disputes, then we could use the GATT protocols to settle them. That was kind of the theory. So again, you wouldn't necessarily need to like know any of these specific, but just being aware that we create these other NGOs in addition to the United Nations to help strengthen and stabilize like the international economy. I think that's maybe a good way of saying that. Also post-World War II effects. One of the big things that happens outside of the United States sphere, but it's going to have a big impact on like later 20th century politics, when the Japanese Empire kind of sweeps through Southeast Asia, what they're doing a lot is like they are taking over countries that had already been taken over, decades before by European powers like France and Great Britain. So they are almost like creating their own empire by like kicking out other empires. And so when Japan is defeated and all of those Japanese soldiers go home, what you get is this sort of power vacuum in a lot of these Southeast Asian countries. It sort of shakes up, the internal politics of the region. In some places, the former like Western imperial powers try to come back. The kind of classic example of this is an area that the French called French Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French after World War II try to come back and be like, hey, we're back. We're the French. We still own this. And there's going to be about 10 years of civil war to try to kick the French back out. In response to the Japanese coming into their countries, lots of like little independence groups had formed, and many of them were communists. As kind of a rebel type group organization. And so, for example, like if you look at where does the Kim family come from that's going to like become the dictator family in North Korea, the answer is that the sort of founding Kim, he was a freedom fighter, quote unquote, against the Japanese occupation of Korea, and he had sort of hooked up with like Soviet Union fighters, and he had become sort of communist, and that's where he kind of rises to fame. So in a lot of, if you're looking at a lot of Southeast Asia and you're like, well, when did like communist presence start in, say, Laos? The answer in a lot of cases is like during the Japanese occupation. So the Japanese empire really shakes up Asia and is going to create this sort of unstable power vacuum-y type situation that will lead to lots of like independence movements and kind of shakeups in the region. Kind of along a similar line, but a little more targeted, is the creation of Israel. This is a tremendously like fraught thing to explain because it's very politically sensitive and etc. But what you should know is that Israel is created as an independent country in the wake of World War II. Largely, it's with the support of Great Britain and the United States, and it's, I would say, fueled by our sort of sympathy and our horror at the Holocaust. So there's been what's called a Zionist movement, a movement to create an independent Jewish state in and around Jerusalem. That's been around for a while in the Jewish community. But as far as like allied support of this, that actually is going to create the country, this happens after World War II, and I think it's fair to call that a pretty strong response to the Holocaust. Israel's creation in the region is going to trigger a lot of internal fighting. There are many people who we're going to come to call Palestinians. This is like an area that was part of the Ottoman Empire for a long time, right? It was like part of Syria, Greater Syria kind of for a long time. So this is their primarily Arabic Muslim people who are going to start to identify as Palestinian. That's kind of a loaded term, but that's what we're going to go with. And what the sort of ensuing conflict in the region, this is what's going to draw the United States into Middle Eastern politics. You may have noticed we haven't really talked about the Middle East so far this year. That's because really until after World War II, the U.S. isn't very involved. Between our strong support for the nation of Israel, which we sort of helped create, and our increasing desire for foreign oil, those two things are really going to drive the U.S. to get more involved in Middle Eastern politics post-World War II. Meanwhile, in Europe, the weird thing that happens in Europe that you need to know a little bit about in the wake of World War II has to do with the division of Germany. So Germany, remember that all of the allies had sort of pinchered in on Germany from all sides, right? And so we had come to a decision at Yalta and then at Potsdam that Germany would be occupied in zones by the various allied countries. You can kind of see that on this colored map over here. So East Germany zone, this zone, the red zone there, that was occupied by the Soviet army because they had kind of swept in from the east. Then these other three zones, the yellow one was the British zone and the green one was the United States zone. And then we give the French like a little zone here along their own border to give them kind of a buffer. Well, all of these kind of West German zones, the US, British, and French zones, they just kind of work together. Our armies are fairly integrated. We have pretty similar government systems. So they're just going to kind of set up a nice democratic parliamentary system over there. In East Germany, on the other hand, the communist Soviet army is going to set up a communist government. And so it's become pretty clear by, I would say, about 1948 or so, that the original plan, which was just to reunify Germany after the occupation was done, that's not going to happen. And so what we wind up with from 1949 until I think 1990, there is no Germany. There's no single country of Germany anymore. We have East Germany, which is communist. And we have West Germany, which is non-communist and is kind of allied with the U.S. and Great Britain, etc. Those are two separate countries. They're going to stay separate from 1949 until, again, I think it's 1990 when they reunify. That would be weird enough. But we also have this whole deal with the capital city of Berlin. So Berlin, the capital of Germany for a long time, big city, think like Paris, New York, really significant and really important. Even though it's in the East German, communist zone, we don't want to leave the whole big important city to be controlled by the Soviets. That doesn't seem fair. So we also divide the occupation of Berlin, the city itself, into zones. And so when Germany divides in 1949, you get this situation here. You can see with this, the kind of gray and red map down at the bottom. So the red, that is East Germany, a separate country. And you can see that East Berlin, a little half of a city inside of it, that's part of East Germany. But this gray dot, that is West Berlin, which is geographically surrounded by East Germany, but is politically part of West Germany. If you're like, yeah, it's weird. It's weird. It's going to cause a lot of problems. Berlin Airlift, Berlin Wall, right? All of those are coming up as a result of the way that Berlin and Germany are divided here. So those are things to like keep in mind for later. Yep. So here's kind of like roughly where Europe is at in 1949. You can see that the Soviet Union has kept a lot of the territory that it took over in the like road to World War II, early World War II years, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right, Belarus, Ukraine, all of this area up here. That is all sort of conquered territory that's now part of the Soviet Union. All of these little stripy countries down here, they're kind of striped with purple. Those are technically still independent countries, but they're they're communist, Soviet communist. They're allied with the Soviet Union. And so when we come back and do notes tomorrow on Wednesday, the 18th, we're going to talk basically about like how do we get here? Like what is it that takes us from allies to this sort of Cold War type situation in Europe? Okay. So that is where we will stop for today. Thank you for your time. Feel free to email me with any questions.